Since last year, the reference HDR grading monitor of choice in the post-production world has been the Sony BVM HX3110, which is capable of hitting 4000 nits on a 10% window and 1000 nits full screen. But let's face it, not everyone can afford its very expensive price of above 30,000 Great British pounds. Spotting a gap in the market, Flanders Scientific and Small HD have launched HDR reference monitors based on a 31.5-inch QD-OLED panel from Samsung Display, although each will still cost above 5 figures. Now, ASUS has taken the same QD-OLED panel and built a professional HDR monitor that's significantly more affordable, namely the ProArt PA32UCDM, which will surely be a market disruptor given its price tag of around £1,600. But how does it perform? Well, let's start with a few attributes we like so much about QD-OLED technology. Bright uniformity was top-notch, with the ASUS PA32UCDM manifesting no dirty screen effect, bending or color tinting on full-field gray slides. And thanks to QD-OLED's top emission architecture, the PA32UCDM maintained its contrast and color fidelity off-axis better than any other non-QD-OLED monitor on the market today. Native 10-bit gradation including near black was superb, not only on the gray ramp test pattern in the Display HDR app, and the rotating quantization pattern from the Spears and Munsell UHD HDR benchmark disc, but also in real-world HDR content, such as the skies in the 4K Blu-ray of The Martian. The ASUS PA32UCDM is a ProArt monitor intended for creative professionals, so naturally we are interested in its color accuracy. Because many SDR picture modes, including the default native preset, went way beyond Rec. 709 in terms of color saturation tracking, Rec. 709 and sRGB were the only stock picture presets that attempted to track SDR colors in an accurate manner. However, despite being calibrated at factory, the SDR gamma measured too dark near black, leading to indistinct shadow detail during SDR viewing. Fortunately, the ASUS PA32UCDM features internal 3D light calibration support, giving us the opportunity to rectify this issue. We first used ASUS free ProArt calibration software to calibrate our review unit to 100 nits peak white, 2.4 gamma and Rec. 709 colors, obtaining excellent results, although there remained a slight dip in near black luminance, causing shadow detail to appear darker than reference. If this is something that could affect your color-critical workflow, you'll be pleased to know that Kalman AutoCal, albeit a paid solution, can yield a flatter near-black gamma while also achieving reference-grade SDR colors, as evidenced on this color checker SG chart where 140 color patches were measured. HDR measurements followed a similar trend, with the out-of-the-box EOTF tracking on our review unit coming in slightly darker than the ST2084 PQ standard above black. Using the ProArt calibration software helped, but Kalman AutoCal made an even bigger improvement, especially when running the most comprehensive fixed-grid 17-point cube calibration with pattern insertion, which, for us, took just under 4 hours. Running AutoCal in one of the user modes would result in a hard clip at panel peak without further intervention, but if you are using the stock HDR PQ BT2020 preset, just select the PQ clip option to mimic the behavior of a reference mastering monitor by hard clipping at the monitor's peak brightness. Note that like on most OLED monitors, the headline HDR peak brightness figure of 1000 nits was only possible on a 3% window size or smaller, and on the ProArt PA32UCDM, only after manually disabling uniform brightness and increasing brightness to max in a stock HDR picture preset. On a 10% window, HDR peak brightness measured 440 nits after calibration to D65 white point, roughly halving to around 220 nits full fill. In other words, while I can wholeheartedly recommend the PA32UCDM for SDR grading once the monitor has been properly calibrated, you will need to exercise some caution if you plan to use it for HDR grading, since the ABL behavior is more aggressive than what you would find on a dual-layer LCD reference monitor. HDR movies that are essentially SDR in an HDR container were handled without trouble. Even content graded up to around 600 nits could match the HX3110 depending on the scene and APL. But once the APL demands went beyond a certain point, the ABL really started to interfere, making accurate HDR grading difficult. Otherwise, DCI P3 color gamut coverage measured 99% in UV terms, whereas REC 2020 coverage was 80%, supported by a spectral power distribution showing beautifully distinct red, green, and blue peaks characteristic of a QD-OLED panel. On a pre-release firmware which will be morphed into MCM105 scheduled to be rolled out in mid-May, the ASUS PA32UCDM correctly reproduced slow panning shots in 24 frames per second videos without introducing telesonic judder, by refreshing at either 72Hz or 144Hz, both being exact multiples of 24. When it came to dark uniformity, our ASUS PA32UCDM review sample looked cleaner than recent QD-OLED TVs we've tested, although the smaller screen size of the QD-OLED monitor may have played a part here. Even though the ASUS PA32UCDM isn't specifically marketed as a gaming monitor, its support for a 240Hz refresh rate and HDR VRR means that it may still appeal to gamers, particularly those who prefer a more refined, understated design over the bold styling and RGB lighting often found on dedicated gaming displays. With this in mind, prospective buyers will be pleased to know that gaming responsiveness on the ASUS PA32UCDM was outstanding across all picture modes, which is hardly surprising since this is a professional-grade monitor with minimal post-processing applied to the image. Input lag measured 9 milliseconds at 60 frames per second, halving to 4.5 milliseconds at 120 fps. Besides 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, the monitor provides an HDMI 2.1 input capable of the full HDMI 2.1 bandwidth of 48 gigabits per second, as well as 48 gigabits per second of DSC or display stream compression bandwidth. While the monitor supports 4K 240Hz refresh rate, at the time we produced this video in April 2025, VRR is capped at 120Hz, although ASUS said that they are working on a firmware update to unlock 240Hz VRR in the near future. Of course, 4K 120Hz HDR VRR aligns perfectly with the maximum output of the Xbox Series X, and once you set the ASUS PA32UCDM to PQ clip, thereby facilitating source-based tone mapping, the monitor would clip at 500 nits for both max TML and max FFTML values, corresponding roughly with the display's HDR peak brightness on a 10% window. Now, some of you will understandably be disappointed with this figure, but it is actually a hardware constraint of a QD-OLED monitor panel with such high pixel density and hence lower pixel aperture ratio, so most QD-OLED monitors to date will behave similarly in HGIG scenarios. Design-wise, the ASUS PA32UCDM looks stunning with its beautifully chiseled bezel and sleek silver metallic finish, exuding a real sense of premium build quality. The stand has a narrow base to save space on your desk, but the ensemble still feels solid and stable due to its substantial weight. The monitor is equipped with an internal cooling fan which emits a very faint hum when activated in HDR mode or over Thunderbolt connection. But of course, it's nowhere near as loud as that heard on dual-layer LCD monitors such as the Sony HX3110. It's also worth noting that the PA32UCDM features some over-provisioning of pixels beyond its native 3840x2160 resolution, ensuring that pixel shifting won't result in any visible cropping around the edges of the image. Speaking of which, the monitor offers a comprehensive suite of anti-screen burn measures. Within the panel protection setting, you can choose between 3 levels which will trigger pixel refresh compensation cycle after 4, 8, and 12 hours of operation respectively. Some users with more sensitive eyes may notice color fringing caused by QD-OLED's triangular subpixel structure, which could potentially limit its suitability as a GUI monitor. Although the PA32UCDM is fitted with speakers, the sound is rather tinny and really only serves to compensate for the absence of a headphone jack. Let's sum up. Thanks to its OLED-driven pixel-level light control and outstanding color accuracy potential, the ASUS PA32UCDM is easily my top recommendation for creative professionals looking for a relatively affordable monitor for SDR grading, provided you have the means to calibrate it to reference standards, taking advantage of its hardware 3D light calibration support. It can even go up to 240Hz refresh rate, which may be of interest to the gaming community. And with a launch price of only £1,600, it won't break the bank either. And so the ASUS PA32UCDM receives our recommended Best Value Award. While the monitor is capable of reaching close to 1000 nits at D65 white point with accurate PQ EOTF tracking, this can only be achieved over very small screen areas, severely limiting its use for serious HDR grading. Nevertheless, its slim form factor, quieter operation, wider viewing angles, and perhaps most importantly, much lower price point may still persuade some independent colorists and post houses to consider investing in these monitors instead of a Sony HX3110 or HX310, which remain the gold standard for HDR grading. In fact, the release of the BVM HX3110 reference monitor has prompted Sony to pivot from OLED to mini LED technology for its flagship TV, for reasons outlined in my explanation video you can watch by clicking here.